This is God's word.
Thank you. A little concerned about Ricky and Alex's leadership. They were fearful that whoever was preaching might not bring their own Bible, so they left one. Weeks and weeks ago, Alex called and said, would you be available to help us preach through the book of Esther? And so we looked at the calendar, and he says, we're going to give you the best chapter of the whole thing. So we are this morning in Esther chapter 6. But we can't just land there. This book of Esther is a masterpiece of storytelling. It is spellbinding as you read it. If it weren't true, you would think, boy, nobody could write a better mythological narrative than this. It goes along, and at every chapter, it leaves you dangling, wondering what's going to happen next. This is a little bit like the little boy whose grandpa is reading him The Princess Bride, and grandpa says, you really need to sleep. He says, no, read some more. That's the story of Esther. And it couldn't be more timely than it is even today. Yesterday, Israel flew 1,700 kilometers into Yemen to push back, as they said, the long arm of Iran. This story happens in modern day Iran. 100 years after Nebuchadnezzar has come and conquered Jerusalem and taken the captives, 100 years later, we have the story of Esther. It starts with, it's got all these actors in the story, all these individuals that play one after the other. King Ahasuerus, his name appears 3 times in the first 2 verses. It seems as though as you're reading the story, you say, okay, the hero of the story has got to be this king. He's flaunting his wealth. So he actually has control, basically world control, all the way from India down to Ethiopia. 127 provinces are under his rule and control. It's the 3rd year of his sitting on the throne, and so he summons all of the leaders from those 127 provinces to come all the way to the capital, Susa, where he is going to show them his wealth and his power, and it's amazing. And he keeps them there for 180 days, half of a year. And then at the end of that 180 days, he throws a big banquet, a big feast for everybody that lives in the capital, Susa, and all those foreign dignitaries that are present there. But in there, he's got this great line. So as you're reading Esther, you get so used to reading the story that you kind of fly right over the details. But he's got this line, and he says in verse 8, drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. Now, if you highlight on your screen, you want to highlight that phrase, or if you're underlining in your Bible, there is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do each as each man desires. So you're kind of reading along. And then all of a sudden it says, and Queen Vashti, it's the first time we've introduced to her, she also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So she's having her own party for the ladies. He's having his party for the men. And in the midst of the party, as the beverage starts to take over his thought clarity process, he says, I've got this drop-dead gorgeous looking queen. I'm going to have her come and present herself to all of my friends. And so he sends 7 of his servants, 7 eunuchs. It's a grand parade that he seeks to create to honor her and to bring her so that she can receive the applause and the approval of all of the people. And contrary to what there is no compulsion, she gives him the Heisman and says, I'm not coming. Now we've got a problem in the kingdom. If the king's wife has the freedom to say no to the king, all of the leaders are like, what are our wives going to do? There is going to be this international world revolt, women against men. And so now we need to have a command written by the king, and the command is like this. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by his 7 eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged. His anger burned within him. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, whether they're high or low. That every man master his own household. Esther chapter 1. Well, as a result of that, they give counsel that from this point on, Queen Vashti should never be allowed to appear in the presence of the king again. So in the 3rd year of his reign, he's now a divorced man. If you look at the timeline, 4 years later, the king realizes all that he lost by pushing Vashti out of the palace, and so they tell him, you ought to have a Miss Universe contest. You should ask all of the leaders from those 127 provinces to have a contest where they choose the most attractive, beautiful woman in their country and send her to Susa, and we're going to have a Miss Universe contest. In that, then suddenly, we are introduced to the girl who stole the king's heart. For the first time, we're introduced to a young woman by the name of Esther. Now, the interesting thing, and you've already been through this, but her history is that she is a 2nd generation at least migrant, a descendant of those Jews that were brought from Jerusalem under King Nebuchadnezzar. She is an orphan. It means that she lost both her mother and father. She finds herself alone in a foreign land. A cousin who is old enough to be her father adopts her and raises her as though she were his own child. It says that God blessed her with natural beauty. For those of you that are naturally attractive, you understand that sometimes the blessing of beauty is actually a curse, because you don't know if people like you because of what you look like or because of what you are. So all of a sudden now she finds herself in the Miss Universe pageant, but this Miss Universe pageant, when you're narrowed to that, it's a 12-month preparation process, so natural beauty is not enough, and so they go through a 12-month process of preparing them to be presented to the king, and in her situation, she suddenly wins the favor of the king, but she also won the favor of all around. There's another theme that keeps wrapping itself through Esther. Who will earn the favor? Where will the approval be? Who will be pleased with them? You come to chapter 3. The end of chapter 2, you've got this. So Esther has now been anointed the new queen. And Mordecai, her adopted father, is serving in the gate of the king's palace, which probably means that he is a judge over there, even though he is a migrant taken as a captive during the Nebuchadnezzar battle. He is viewed as a man of wisdom and authority. And as he's serving at the king's gate, he hears a rumor that there's an assassination plot taking place. He checks out the details of that, and he sends information to his adopted daughter, Esther, who warns the king that 2 of his most trusted, these are the ones that guard the thresholds, literally the last 2 security forces that you would pass to go into the presence of the king, and those 2 men became angry with the king, and they decided to snuff him. So they are hanged. Brings us to chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite. Now, the Agagite, why does he throw that in there? This goes all the way back to, remember when King Saul sinned against God and he let King Agag live when he was required to take his life out. This is an heir of that king, King Agag. And this Haman, the son of Haman, and advanced him to set his throne above all the officials. So you got 127 provinces. You've got great rulers in Susa. You have great leadership. But above all of those, there is one man that rises above all of them. This man is Haman. But the problem with Haman in that position is that he is insecure, and easily threatened. Notice in chapter 3, it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. And so the end result of that is that there is a genocidal edict given. Not only must Mordecai, the Jew, die, but all Jews must die. It's not difficult to see a direct connection between Haman and Hamas of our day. The determination that the people of God must be completely annihilated. That brings us to chapter 4. In chapter 4, the word has now come to Esther about Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. An edict has been sent out. Mordecai hears of it, researches it, finds a copy. I was like, they don't have a Kinko's on the corner to copy. Somehow he gets a copy of the order. And he also knows exactly the amount of money that Haman has promised. If you will allow us to annihilate the Jews, I will put $165 million in the king's bank vaults. And for that, we find the king was willing to go. The interesting thing about King Ahasuerus is as the story unfolds, you find out that he's really not much of a leader at all. He is easily influenced by everybody around him. He can be bought, and he can be persuaded, and he can be manipulated. Yet in this story, the one who says that the wives should all be obedient to their husbands, God works in an amazing way with Esther, his second wife, to manipulate and to maneuver the man who gave the edict. Chapter 5. In order to set him up, Queen Esther comes up with an incredible plan. And that is that she would host a special dinner, a banquet, simply for 3. Haman falls completely for it. Now it's just King Ahasuerus, it's Queen Esther, and it's Haman, and we're having dinner together. What Haman forgot to read was what Solomon wrote in Proverbs 23. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. He says in chapter 25 of Proverbs, do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. Chapter 6, we're going to start reading in verse 9 of chapter 5 to get the flow. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. He's just had dinner with the king and his bride. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself. He went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. He called his city group together. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches. I mean, this is a guy that could offer $165 million to the king. This guy is loaded. He's wealthy. And the number of his sons, he has 10 sons, and multiple sons is a sign of success in their culture. And he recorded for them all the promotions with which the king had, there's the word, honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. And he goes on to say, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast that she prepared. And tomorrow I am also invited by her together with the king. Yet, all of this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. All of the blessings, all the delight, all the prosperity, all the honor, all the distinction means nothing if one Jew refuses to bow before me. Counsel from his bride. Then wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high, 75 feet high, be made. In the morning, tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. No charges, no accusations. You have authority. Just command his death. And then when Mordecai's dead and out of the way, then go joyfully with the king to the feast. Just kill Mordecai early in the morning and then just celebrate with dinner. And this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. And now we move to chapter 6. Sleepless in Susa. On that night. So during the night, Haman's erecting this 75-foot tall gallows to hang his enemy on. At the same time, on that night, the king could not sleep. Sovereign insomnia kept him awake. And not being able to come to sleep, he orders the book of memorable deeds, that is the Chronicles, that were to be read before the king. He said, if anything would put me to sleep, reading the history of our nation ought to do that. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? And the king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And the king said, then who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared before him. And the king's young man told him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, assuming that it's him, let royal robes be brought, which the king has himself worn, and the horse that the king himself has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble officials. Make this a very public kind of ordination celebration. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, just as you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Can you imagine the shock? It's like, not him. He's sentenced to death. We're standing here in the shadow of the gallows upon which he will hang. And then the king goes on, leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai. Everybody in the king's courts knows that he despises this guy, and now he is publicly crowning and celebrating him. And he led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him. He must have choked on every word. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Notice how many times the word honor has appeared in verse 3, again in verse 6, and in verse 7, and again in verse 9, and again right before verse 10, and here we are now in verse 11. Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. That was the coveted blessing that Haman sought. He's been elevated above every other leader. He is the prime minister. There is only one authority. His direct account goes straight to the king. He has been elevated to that level, and yet there is still, as Ricky preached, there is still something missing in his soul. There is something that is not yet satisfied. And now he has to declare that that which he coveted went to the one that he despised. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. That's the mark of true humility. He has been honored above everyone else in the city, everyone else in the nation. But when the celebration is over, Mordecai simply resumes his former responsibilities. He returns to the king's gate, humbly serving. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning, and with his head covered. The symbol that Mordecai used when he discovered that the Jews were under an edict to be annihilated. Now, the one who is the second in authority, who actually scripted that edict, is now going, resembling the same sorrow. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends. He went back to his city group, told them everything that had happened to him. Now listen to this line. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall. Do you see this glorious inversion? In the shadow of the gallows, God reverses things. He is waiting for the day when Mordecai would simply bow, would fall before him in honor and respect. And now even his wife says, you yourself have already begun to fall, to bow to the very one that you despise. But they go on to say, if he is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him. It assaulted the chosen people of God. Years ago, God had spoken to Abraham, and he said, those who bless you, I will bless. But those who curse you, I will curse. And even pagans understood that if he is a Jew, you will not defeat him. The warning of a wise wife. Her counsel was erect a gallows. And now her warning is that if he is a Jew, you will ultimately fall before him. When you read that, you immediately think of the trial of Jesus in Matthew 27. And as Pilate is asking the people, assuming that they would choose Barabbas to be hung and Jesus to be released, they inverted that and they demanded the release of Barabbas, and they called for the crucifixion of Christ. Matthew 27 says, when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release for you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? For he knew it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today. The great contrast between Haman and Mordecai was not in their earthly posture and position, but it was in the character of their heart. They both operated out of their character. Mordecai's character was one of humility, of service, of others first. Haman's character was one of self-serving, coveting only the honor that he could gain. Haman fell because he committed the same sin that Lucifer. When Lucifer stood in the presence of the angels and he desired not God's throne, but he wanted to be like God. He wanted to be, as it were, the prime minister of heaven. And he was cast out of God's presence. According to Proverbs chapter 6, there are 6 things that God hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. The first one is haughty eyes. Pride comes before the fall. Listen to these verses from Proverbs that deal directly with the issue of Haman. When pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with humility comes wisdom. 11:2. 15:33 says, the fear of the Lord teaches a man wisdom, and humility comes before honor. Verse 18, or chapter 18, verse 12, before his downfall a man's heart is proud, but humility comes before honor. Chapter 29, verse 23, one's pride will bring him low, but he who is lowly in spirit will obtain honor. Chapter 15, verse 25 said, God is dedicated to tearing down the homes of the proud. For that reason, the Apostle Paul picks up on this theme when instructing the church that was facing some division in Philippi. And in chapter 2, he said, have this attitude in yourselves, which was yours in Christ Jesus. Therefore, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow. Mark chapter 10, verse 45 says, for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Isaiah 66:2 said, but this is the one to whom I will look, he who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my word. Like I said, the story of Esther is one of this dangling anticipation that there's a crisis that comes, and then the crisis is resolved, and then another crisis, and you come to the end of each chapter and you wonder what's next. I apologize, but this is a spoiler alert. From chapter 9, we read, the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them, for Mordecai was great in the king's house. His fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews, popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. So answering the question that the king posed to Haman, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? I would like to suggest that from the text there are these four things. The first one is to recognize this: unrequited deeds of kindness will not go unrewarded. When you study the scramble, the attempt, the battle that Haman goes through to try to attain greater honor, and you contrast that to Mordecai, who simply provided the queen for the king, and hearing that the king's life is in danger, did he protect the king because of his person? Probably not. The king is a moral pig. He protected him because he was a man that sat in a God-appointed position. He defended the king, and he expected nothing in return. There must have been times when he wondered, I saved the king, and here I am still sitting at the king's gate, unrecognized and unrewarded. And then God sovereignly gives insomnia to the king, and he says, bring to me the records. And they're reading about the day that his life was spared because the queen had been informed by her adopted father. And he says, what had been done for him? In your and my life, we need to recognize there are many times that we do deeds of kindness that seem to be unnoticed, unrecognized, and unrewarded. But God always takes notes, and God ultimately always rewards those deeds that are done for his glory. The second thing is that we must beware lest you erect the gallows from which you yourself will one day be hanged. In the manipulation, God is a master of glorious inversions. And if we seek to take others down in order to elevate ourselves, ultimately, as he said to the nation of Israel time and again, as you have done to others, so it'll be done to you. Be cautious that you don't create gallows which ultimately become your hanging place. Third is that the journey to honor will always lead through the pathways of humble service. The one who scrambled the most to fill that void that was in his life, just one more honor. In fact, that one Jew at the gate of the king, refusing to bow before him, could steal all of the joy of his position. We need to recognize that if we want to experience the blessing of honor, it will require that we find it in the pathway of humble service. Jesus says, the greatest among you must first be your servant. And finally, and the most amazing story of it all, is behold the hiddenness of the hand of God. Our circumstances can be, can you imagine a young immigrant girl who is totally an orphan, raised by a cousin old enough to be her father? So what is this circumstance? What is this turmoil in my life? Why were my family taken out of my homeland, and why am I here? Behind the scenes in the book of Esther is the hiddenness of the hand of God. So we begin the book by asking the question, as the story unfolds, who will be the hero of the story? If you read all the chapters, you'll read that the Jews are mentioned 47 times. Are they the heroes of the story? The king, just in that description, is mentioned 148 times. Perhaps the king is the hero of the story. Ahasuerus himself is mentioned by name 27 times, 3 times in the first 2 verses. You start the book and you're thinking, okay, the king is the hero of the story. And then we're introduced to the orphan immigrant girl who goes from rags to riches and is the queen and is the woman of great influence on the king, who demanded that all wives must obey their husbands. She's mentioned 48 times in the story. Her attitude is that you should think not of yourself, but you should always be thinking of others. Perhaps she's the hero. Why did she get the book named after her? But then you've got Haman. Haman, the villain of the story. He seems to dominate virtually every page up until now. He thinks only of himself and he oppresses others, but he's mentioned 52 times in the story. And then there's Mordecai. Why isn't the book named Mordecai? He's mentioned 54 times in the book. But I would like to suggest that the hero of the story is the one who is not mentioned one time. It is the silence of God. And yet we find his fingerprints on every page of the book. The true people of God will ultimately see the blessing of God. God will ultimately, through his people, bring a king that is better than every other king. He will set a better example. He will host a better feast. He will grant a better grace and favor. He will keep a better promise. He will love a better bride. He will reign as a greater king. And he will give, ultimately, those who serve him a greater honor. Now, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Verse 14, I love this. And while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs, those 7 who do this glorious celebration parade through the streets, arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared before him. And the question is that feast his last supper? Lord, I thank you that in all of the turmoil and the chaos of our lives, in the current events even of today, that we have this bold and unshakable confidence that it is the hiddenness of God, the thumbprint and the plan of God that is slowly being unfolded. And when circumstances seem to make no sense to us at all, that you are faithfully accomplishing your plan and your purpose. You're always present. You're always working. You're always rewarding those who humbly and quietly serve you. Give your people the hearts to be a Mordecai who lives his life for others and not for himself, in order that the Lord might use us in order to make your name most famous in your world. We pray in Jesus' name.